Once upon a time, there was a young boy named Peter who lived in a small village in the woods with his family. They lived on the edge of a deep, dark forest. For as long as he could remember, his family warned him to stay out of the dark forest. It was too dangerous for him. Children who went into the forest disappeared and never returned. One day, when little Peter was near the edge of the forest, he heard what sounded like voices coming from the forest. Before he knew it, he had wandered to the edge of the forest. In the distance, he heard a beautiful voice singing quietly. Peter could not help himself. He followed the sound. Then he came upon a beautiful woman standing off in the distance, quietly singing to herself. Little Peter was awestruck by the young woman's beauty. He quietly approached her, not wanting to announce his presence. The woman, who did not seem to notice him, soon walked off into the distance as she quietly continued singing her enchanting song. Little Peter, so entranced by the allure of the woman, would visit the same spot in the forest almost daily. After a long period of time and almost giving up hope, Peter once again saw her off in the distance. Once again, he was entranced by her beauty and froze in place as he spied on her. As before, she did not notice him and, over time, walked back into the dense forest. After this second time, Peter went back to the forest again and again, hoping to get a glance at this woman once more. Many years later, Peter, now a young man, became a woodsman like his father. Peter, who no longer had any fear of the forbidden forest, would often chop down fresh wood for his carpentry work. One particular day, while walking very deep in the forest, Peter saw what looked like a dilapidated structure off in the distance. As he approached, he saw a young woman standing in front of the structure. The young woman was beautiful. She also looked his way and had an incredible smile on her face. Peter walked directly up to the lovely young girl and introduced himself as Peter the Woodsman. The young woman stated her name was Margaret, and she was very pleased to meet him. Being entranced by this young beauty, Peter had a difficult time speaking. He finally asked her if she lived there. Margaret, seeing Peter's discomfort, just giggled and explained how she had always lived out here in the forest and had not heard of these strange stories of the forbidden forest. Peter could not get out of his mind how much this young woman looked like the woman he had seen so many years ago when he was just a young boy. This could not be the same woman. That is not possible. Margaret laughed and said that he must have seen her mother, who she strikingly resembled. Unfortunately, she had passed away from Blatton many years ago. That is most likely why he had never seen her again. Peter was also surprised that Margaret lived alone out in the forest. Her father had also passed away many years before her mother. She had been taught by her mother how to hunt and take care of herself in the forest. The only problem she had to deal with was her loneliness. Peter had to start heading home as it was starting to get dark. Margaret made him promise that he would come back and visit her tomorrow. Peter was more than willing to oblige. He was smitten with the young beauty and couldn't wait to come back and see her again. Every day, Peter went back to Margaret's cabin. Over time, they both fell in love with one another. The only problem seemed to be that Margaret was afraid to leave the forest and was not comfortable being around other people. She had fallen madly in love with Peter, but she was too afraid to meet any of his family and friends. Peter had also fallen so madly in love with Margaret that he did not argue the fact. He was sure that he could convince her to meet his family and friends in the near future. As the days went by, Peter could not help himself any longer. So he asked for Margaret's hand in marriage. Margaret's eyes lit up as never before, and she immediately accepted his proposal. With Margaret's insistence, they both agreed on an unofficial ceremony by themselves in the woods, the place where they fell in love together. Peter immediately moved out of his home with his parents and did not tell them where he went. He could not control himself as he just wanted to be with Margaret. The day they married each other was the happiest Peter had ever been. Over time, life between them was wonderful. Peter did not miss seeing his family or friends. He was head over heels in love with Margarete. She was wonderful. Margaret also loved to cook and rarely went a minute without having a smile on her face. Peter loved that Margaret liked to sing to herself. The songs she sang harkened back to the siren song of her mother that he heard as such a young boy. Who would have thought that he would end up being married to this wonderful, beautiful woman? One morning, Peter woke up and stepped outside the cabin and found a horrible scene. There was one or more animals butchered outside the front door of their cabin. He tried to hide the horror from Margaret. This was very upsetting. Could it be the townspeople somehow harassing them? Were they upset he left his family and friends? Peter was also surprised that he did not hear any noise at night outside the cabin. That was not good. As time progressed, he found that this happened occasionally. What kind of sick animal was doing this? This really bothered Peter. This was disgusting. He had to get to the bottom of this and prevent it from ever happening again. Secretly, without telling Margarete, Peter decided to stay awake at night so he could find out what was going on. He would pretend to fall asleep and listen closely to anything approaching the cabin. For a fortnight, Peter kept vigilant. He was able to not fully sleep, but sort of keep himself half in and out of sleep. He could hear Margaret's quiet breathing next to him in their bed. He could only think how he needed to protect her from whoever was doing this. Then one morning he awakened groggy. He realized that he had been unable to remain awake. Stepping out of the cabin, Peter was horrified. Again, there was a mauled dead animal just outside their front door. This is happening again. Quickly grabbing his cell phone, Peter went outside and buried the poor animal as far away from the cabin as he could get. He had to do it quickly, as Margaret was still sound asleep. She could wake any moment. After he buried the poor thing, he went back into the cabin to clean up. He noticed the wooden cup next to his bed. He remembered that Margaret had given him some tea when he went to bed. Peter thought to himself, "It has to be something in the tea that made me fall asleep." That was probably why he once again missed this intrusion. Peter decided that if Margaret tried to give him tea, he would have to pretend to take it. Peter went back to trying to keep attentive at night. Once again, things were quiet after a few weeks. Then, one night, Margaret came to him with tea. Peter accepted it but made sure he poured it out when Margaret turned her back. He could not take the risk. He had to find out who was causing this chaos outside their home. In the early morning hours, Peter stirred as he heard Margaret get up. He thought to himself, maybe she needed to use the outhouse. He listened as she crossed the room. Peeking with one eye open, he could make out her sitting down at the old loom which had belonged to Margaret's mother. Margaret started to quietly sing as she started spinning the loom in the dark. Peter continued to try to see what she was doing. After a period of time, he heard Margaret exit the cabin from the front door. Not long after, he heard a blood-curdling howl just outside in the woods. Peter stood up from the bed. He went to the door, and Margaret was gone. The forest was pitch black. Peter walked over to the loom and saw that Margaret's clothes were in a pile on the floor. He then looked at the threads attached to the loom. When he reached out to touch them, they felt soft. He sniffed them, and they had Margaret's smell on them. Confused, Peter sat back on the bed and waited for her return. After a period of time, he once again heard horrible noises outside the cabin, mixed with howling. It sounded like an animal squealing in pain. Peter shivered in the bed, waiting. Then the door to the cabin opened quietly. Peter kept his eyes closed. Margaret went back to the loom, and the loom started spinning. He waited a few minutes and slowly opened his eyes. It was a scene of horror he had never imagined. Sitting at the loom was some sort of monstrous skeleton. This was not his wife. Peter froze. Then the monstrous thing started singing. The voice was Margaret's, and it was singing her beautiful song. Peter watched as the loom spun faster and faster. It was dark, but it looked like the thread on the loom was reattaching skin to this monster's body. This monster was his wife. Shivering in bed, Peter lay as still as possible. He held his breath as this thing got into bed with him. Remaining awake until dawn, Peter got up and looked back towards the bed. Sleeping in the bed was his beautiful Margaret. Holding back the terror, Peter stepped outside the cabin and started to run. He slipped on something on the ground and fell. He was covered in blood and was on top of what appeared to be a dead animal. Lying face to face with this pile of flesh, Peter realized that this was not an animal. There was no hair. Could it be? Oh no! He got back up and ran until he was as far away as possible. Out of breath, he finally stopped. I have been living with a murderous witch. I have been fooled. I cannot go back to my family for what I have done. It felt like Margaret's spell had finally been broken. Peter, sweating and nervous, quickly came up with a plan on how to handle this problem. Peter slowly made his way back to the cabin, stopping to wash himself by a creek. He got back home and walked into the cabin. Margarete, as always, was at the stove cooking breakfast. It took all of Peter's willpower to approach her and give her a hug. Peter continued this charade for days. Finally, one night, Margaret came to him in bed and offered him some tea. He knew what was going to happen. When Margaret turned her head, Peter dumped out the tea as he did last time. He feigned sleep and stayed on the bed. As before, in the late-night hours, he heard Margaret get up and go to the loom. Peter's body quaked as he spied on what she was doing. She was singing and spinning off her skin until she was nothing but a horrid skeleton. Peter closed his eyes tightly to avoid his fright. Margaret quietly left the cabin. Peter jumped up out of bed and started creating a slurry of salt and pepper in a bucket. He took off the spool of skin from the loom and soaked it in the bucket. After waiting a while, he replaced it on the loom and dumped out the bucket. Then, lying back in bed, Peter waited. During this time, he put his hands over his ears to block the horrid sounds he heard outside the cabin. Finally, as the early light of the morning started to show, Margaret entered back into the cabin. Peter held his breath. If she sensed something suspicious, he couldn't tell in the dim light. She seemed like she was in a hurry, as it was quickly getting light outside. Peter, with his eyes closed, heard the loom spinning faster than he had ever heard it move. He opened up one eye and peeked out as soon as he heard the loom slowing down. In the dim light, he saw her reach down and pick up her nightshirt from the floor. Peter waited. As she started approaching the bed, Margaret started reacting. She was scratching and ripping at her skin. Peter quickly jumped up out of the bed and grabbed his axe. He hacked at the loom as Margaret was standing in the semi-darkness, wailing a horrible sound, scratching at her skin. After destroying the loom, Peter turned to Margaret, who was now howling on the floor and ripping at her skin. In her frenzy, she had ripped off chunks of her skin. It was a scene of horror. Peter raised his axe and took it to this horrible witch. The next thing Peter remembered was that he was running through the woods at full speed. He made it back to his town and rushed to his parents' home. Yanking the door open, he saw his parents and siblings. His family was so happy to see him that they all hugged him as never before. The end.